Well, and I had read somewhere that we have tens of thousands of thoughts every day. Most we don't recognize, but 80% of them tend to be negative and self-critical. And I think that's something that all of us struggle with is this self-talk that, like you had mentioned, and kind of along the lines of you would never say this to your best friend. So why are you saying it to yourself? And so at any point as a therapist, do you try and help that individual kind of defeat that negative self-talk and grow kind of an internal sense of friendship with oneself? Or how does that growth look like, that trajectory of recovery and healing?
For me, I like to really talk about balanced thinking. I actually don't like the term positive thinking, right? Just think positive, which is nice, but no one's going to believe that, right? If they're feeling a certain way, it's for a certain reason. So if I'm speaking with someone who, um, you know, thinks negatively about themselves a lot, or they feel a lot of guilt, for a certain call, it's like, okay, I'm not going to argue against that, right? You're having these thoughts for a reason. Okay, well, let's look at the whole picture though, right? So yes, maybe you did screw up on that call, right? I don't know. Let's go through the call, but then also, where is all the evidence that maybe you're not a screw up, right? Or maybe it wasn't a catastrophic mistake. And so it's really about looking at the whole picture. Because if I'm arguing with a client about a strong thought they have, it's not going to go anywhere. It's just going to make them dig in, harder. But if we can start to look at what is the whole picture here, then they can start to get in the habit of recognizing, okay, I'm having this thought. It's not a great thought. What is the big picture here, right? What is all the evidence for and against this thought? And so it's really about just kind of balancing it, because going back to the filter, we
Mm-hmm.
tend to look through filters. You know, I have this kind of silly example I share with my clients when I'm trying to introduce this concept. A few years ago, I got a new car, and it was red before my car had been boring black, right? And so, I showed it to my parents. My mother's like, "Oh my goodness, a red car! That's so flashy," right? And then a few months later, I'm talking to her, and she says, "You know what, Vivien? Everyone has red cars now." I said, "Mom, what are you talking about?" She said, "No, everywhere I go, there's so many red cars. Everyone has red cars now." And so she's not making up the fact that there's red cars, right? They exist.
Mm-hmm.
But she has this filter because she's predisposed to look for the red cars now because it's on her mind. And what she's not noticing, of course, are the blue cars and the green cars and the white cars and black cars and all that, right? And so we tend to let in the information that fits our preconceived notions, right?
Right.
And so if my template is, you know, I, I'm a weak person, for example, or I'm a bad person, I'm going to filter whatever happens through that filter, right? Rather than being able to look at all the evidence. So it's really about, okay, there are red cars. Okay, let's look at all the other cars so we can balance out the whole picture.
Yeah, and I'm kind of thinking about the experience of public safety work culture. So many of those cultures are kind of right through recruit training onwards in the early stages, kind of focused on the concept of two eyes, two ears, one mouth, and the idea that some of the negativity bias you might have towards yourself before you get on can kind of be even more exposed within that organizational culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious what you think about some of the challenges that we face in public safety, more from an organizational standpoint of how members are trained in this paramilitary work culture, and in some ways leaves us more susceptible to struggling in silence because it's kind of uh, still, unfortunately, acceptable to only express certain parts of your emotional reality.
Yeah. And I think people sometimes, they have this all or nothing thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe if I'm a chief of a service, I worry that if we bring in all this talk about emotions and feelings and all this like feel good stuff, that all of a sudden all my members are going to be breaking down crying in calls.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so it's this all or nothing approach. It's either don't say anything or the floodgates are going to open. And I think it's recognizing, you know, being able to that members are going to traumatic situations. And yes, they can suck it up and they can get through the call. They need to suck it up to get through a call. right? Right. No problem, no argument there. But it's also recognizing that, okay, you're dealing with humans. You're not hiring robots for a reason, and they're going to be impacted by certain types of calls. You look at pro athletes, right? You watch a basketball game. There's all kinds of small injuries here and there, right? Okay, Lowry's injured. Okay, let's take him off the court. Maybe he sits out for the rest of the game, or maybe he sits out for the first half, right? So that's early intervention so that he can heal and get a little better, and then he can get his strength back and get back in the game. The same kind of idea. If I'm on the front lines and I respond to this very traumatic scene, okay, so this isn't healthy for human beings to be a part of. Okay, what do I need after? Maybe I need, an hour out after. Maybe I need the rest of the shift. Maybe I need a bit more time. But that's the early intervention. So it's normalizing that, okay, that was a pretty bad call. You may be fine or you may have a reaction, and I want to give you some time to recover. Right? And that's and I wish that management could see more of the bigger picture there. Just like the NBA coach, okay, give my members a little bit of time to heal, and they're going to get better faster, and then it's not going to build up and build up where now Lowry's ankle is mangled and he can't return for the rest of the season.
Mm-hmm. So what you're really speaking about, as far as I understand it, is that mental health injuries, post-traumatic stress injuries, operational stress injuries, however we want to define them, are really acquired stress injuries that we experience as a result of the type of calls that we're going to as a member of public safety. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it does kind of intertwine with some of our life experiences,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, what I see, and this is anecdotal, but I see quite a bit in my practice. Um, lots of members obviously have attended to pediatric calls, right? Pediatric death calls. But I find the ones that get hammered really hard with it are the ones who are about to have a child or just recently had a child. And of course, you can imagine they're more vulnerable because this is that stage of life, and they're more vulnerable to things involving children. Whereas maybe they had a similar call 10 years ago, but they didn't have any kids at that point, and so they were fine, right? So it's definitely what we see in the job, but it can interact with our own personal experiences as well.
And a mutual contact friend of ours is Deputy Chief Rob Martin from Kitchener Fire. And he spoke a lot about your hierarchy of trauma exposure. And that really stood out for him. So can you explain a little bit about what that terminology means?
Right. So when trauma happens, obviously the things that remind us of a trauma can trigger it, right? Trigger memories, trigger the fight, flight, freeze reaction. You think of someone who had a bad car accident, right? So it makes sense that that individual might have anxiety being in a car or driving a car, being on the highway for a while, right? That makes sense to us. What is a bit trickier for people to understand is that when things are associated with your job, things that you've worked with for years can start to trigger some of that reaction, right? So yeah, a medic may have been on the job for 15 years, obviously never had trouble with an ambulance before, but now they had this traumatic event, and so now the ambulance or the lights or the sirens can become a trigger, right? And then so people find that very odd because I've been working with this for years. Well, a car accident victim has been driving a car for years, right? And it still makes sense to us. And so I've worked with many, many individuals, not just public safety, people who were injured in their workplace with the return to work. And I'm not going to pretend I made this up. This is how we operated in the trauma program at CAMH. So a very effective treatment for many people with PTSD is what's called prolonged exposure.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two components. One is the imaginal exposure, so exposure to memories of the trauma. So that's not what I'm talking about here. The other is in vivo exposures, or exposures to things in the community or out there, right? To things. And you always want it to be graduated, because if you throw someone into the most triggering situation, their fight or flight is going to be overwhelmed. It's going to be too much, right? So if I had major trauma on the truck, working as a medic, and all of a sudden it's been several months and I just jumped back onto a truck for 12 hours, it's probably going to be overwhelming for me. So what I like to do with workers' comp and the individual and the service, if we can, is kind of work at this gradual hierarchy, right? So it's before even they go back to work, we working on stuff in my office or, in their community, looking at photos and videos, for example, of trucks or, that part of the city where something bad happened. Putting on their uniform, that can be a, really big one for many people. And then maybe, so I'll just go with the medic example still. So, and then maybe they go and sit outside, a paramedic station, right? So they're slowly building out. And then, when it's time to be able to go back to work, so maybe they gradually return to modified. And this way we can build in more gradual exposures that we can't do before, right? So maybe now they can go sit in an ambulance, not with it driving. Maybe, then they can go in the back of the ambulance and kind of play around with some of the equipment there. Maybe they go to, and ride out with the colleague and they turn the lights on if they can, right? So it's this gradual exposure, because if you're going, each step is going to be a bit of a challenge for the client. And, we want that to happen because we want the trigger response, because the way it is proposed to work is that with each step, it brings up that fight, flight, freeze response, which does not feel good. And we think in that moment, oh my God, I can't handle this. This is the worst. I'm going to fall apart. But that reaction can't last forever. So if we can kind of stay in a situation, if I can sit in the ambulance for 20, 30, 40 minutes, at some point that anxiety is going to start to come down, right? It has to. We just can't sustain it forever. So physiologically, that happens with exposures. But then mentally, I'm relearning. And again, this sounds really basic, but when we're in the fight, flight, freeze response, when we get traumatized, our response goes instantly. So it can be hard to think straight. So we're relearning that this is safe most of the time, right? Do bad things happen in an ambulance? Yes. But most of the time when I'm in it, is it safe? Yes. And I can handle this. I'm not falling to pieces, right? And so with each step, you're reducing the fight, flight, freeze response. You're relearning that most of the time it's safe, and you're relearning that you can handle it. Now, of course, if you throw me on the ambulance for 12 hours, it's going to be too much for me to learn, right? Because I'm going to be too amped up. So if you do it gradually with each step, their anxiety's coming down, their confidence is going up, right? And they're going to be much more clear-minded when they do eventually return to the road or whatever their position is they end up in.